Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. It was a regular Tuesday evening when the first seed of doubt crept into my mind, subtle as a whisper. Sophie and I had been married for over a decade, our lives intertwined like vines around a sturdy tree. We had our routines, our shared jokes, our rituals that felt both comforting and binding. But over the last few months, something had changed. She'd started working late, too often. She would mention last-minute projects, unplanned dinners with clients. I tried to brush off the unease, but each time she closed the door behind her, I felt a chill settle in its place. The first sign wasn't obvious. It came in small things, a missed text, a subtle distance. Once, we were a couple that celebrated small victories, from promotions to the perfect homemade lasagna. But lately, Sophie seemed distant, like a guest in her own life. She'd barely glance up from her phone, a smile here, a nod there, all without really seeing me. I told myself it was just the stress of work, the inevitable weight that piles on in any long-term relationship. We'd been through hard times before and always found our way back. I just had to be patient. Or so I thought. One evening, while she was showering, I noticed her phone on the bedside table. The screen was on, displaying an unread message. My instinct was to turn away, to respect her privacy, but my hand acted before my mind could catch up. The message preview read, "Can't wait to see you again tonight." My stomach clenched. I felt frozen, unable to process what I was reading. I told myself it was innocent, maybe a friend with a weird sense of humor. I almost laughed at how absurd it was to assume anything else. But as I scrolled through their conversation, reality hit me like a sledgehammer. The messages weren't just friendly, they were intimate, filled with inside jokes, shared plans, and flirtations that danced around the boundaries of propriety. His name was Eric, a coworker I'd only heard her mention once or twice, always casually, like he barely mattered. Yet here he was, texting my wife late into the night, his words lingering on her screen in plain view. My heart pounded as I read, my mind racing to keep up with the truth unfolding before me. I knew I shouldn't read further, but I couldn't help it. Each message felt like another wound, each reply a reminder of the betrayal. When she came out of the shower, I quickly put her phone back on the nightstand, my face calm but my heart in pieces. She walked in, wrapped in a towel, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright from the hot water. She looked the same as always, warm, familiar, safe. But now, a shadow lingered, casting her in a different light. As she spoke about her day, I could hear the echo of her words to Eric, her laughter still ringing in the message I just read. I tried to play along, nodding and smiling, my responses automatic. Inside, I was drowning, trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt foreign. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Each time she left for work, each time her phone buzzed, I felt a pang of suspicion, a gnawing doubt that eroded whatever trust remained. I began to watch her closely, analyzing her movements, her words, her expressions. Every laugh, every smile, every moment she spent looking at her phone became a part of the puzzle, each piece leading me further down the path I dreaded to follow. I became someone I barely recognized, a stranger lurking in his own home, consumed by the need to uncover the truth. I started paying more attention to the details, her schedule, her excuses, the way she spoke about her work projects. Sometimes, she'd come home later than usual, her face flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, but the doubts wouldn't let go. They clung to me, tightening their grip each time I tried to brush them off. I was haunted by questions I was too afraid to ask, answers I knew would shatter the life we'd built together. One night, as I lay awake beside her, I replayed every moment, every sign I might have missed. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear, fear of the truth, fear of losing her, fear of what I might become if I let the anger consume me. So I waited, hoping against hope that I was wrong, that I'd misread the signs, that this was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew. I knew, and the knowledge burned like a fire I couldn't extinguish. Then came the day that pushed me over the edge. She had mentioned a work retreat over the weekend, a chance to unwind with her team after a busy season. The details were vague, her explanations hurried, as though she was trying to get through the conversation without giving too much away. I tried to act nonchalant, to pretend I believed her, but every fiber of my being was screaming that this was a lie. The retreat felt like a cover, an excuse wrapped in just enough truth to be believable. I decided to play along. I told her to have a great time, to enjoy the break, all while the plan took shape in my mind. As soon as she left, I began making arrangements. I contacted a locksmith to change the locks on the house. I gathered her belongings, packing them neatly into boxes and lining them up by the front door. Every item felt like a symbol of the life we'd shared, each box a testament to the time, the memories, the love that had once defined us. But now, they were just things, remnants of a story that had ended long before I was ready to accept it. As I worked, a strange calm settled over me. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, steely resolve. I wasn't doing this out of spite or revenge. I was doing it to reclaim my life, to take back the pieces she had stolen with each lie, each deceitful glance. By the time I finished, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the boxes lined up in the entryway. It felt poetic, in a way, the end of one chapter, the beginning of another. As the weekend arrived, I watched her pack her suitcase, the familiar movements now laced with a strange sense of betrayal. She was calm, almost cheerful, chatting about the work retreat as if it were just another normal part of our lives. I felt sick, each word a reminder of the facade she was keeping up, the lies she was weaving right in front of me. I smiled and nodded, my responses mechanical. But inside, I was simmering, every word pushing me closer to the edge. When she finally left, a peculiar silence filled the house. I stood by the door, listening to the distant sound of her car pulling out of the driveway, the quiet hum of the engine fading as she drove away. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, a hollow ache that settled in my chest. This was real. It was really happening. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and turned back toward the house. I had work to do. The first thing I did was change the locks. I'd arranged for the locksmith to come over as soon as she left, his van pulling up just minutes after her car disappeared from sight. He was efficient, polite, and, thankfully, didn't ask any questions. I watched as he worked, his hands deftly removing the old locks and replacing them with new ones. When he was done, he handed me the keys, a set of shiny new keys that felt heavy in my hand. They were a symbol of my decision, a physical reminder of the boundary I was setting. After he left, I began packing up her things. I went room by room, gathering her clothes, her shoes, the little trinkets she'd collected over the years. Each item felt like a piece of a puzzle, a reminder of a life we'd built together, a life that now felt like a lie. I tried not to dwell on it, to keep my focus on the task at hand. But as I packed, memories surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. I remembered the day we'd moved into this house, the laughter, the excitement, the feeling of starting something new and beautiful. It all felt so distant now, like a story that had happened to someone else. As I packed, I found myself lingering over certain items, a scarf she'd worn on one of our first dates, a photo album filled with snapshots of vacations and holidays, moments that had once meant everything to me. I held each item for a moment, letting the memories wash over me before setting it aside, placing it carefully in the boxes lined up by the front door. By the time I was finished, the house felt empty, stripped of her presence, of the traces of a life we'd shared. I looked at the boxes, a silent row of memories that no longer felt like my own. The last thing I did was write the note. I sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, the words forming slowly, deliberately. I wanted to keep it short, to say only what needed to be said. I know about Eric. I've changed the locks. Your things are packed by the door. Good luck with your new life. I read it over a few times, the simplicity of it surprising me. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet resignation, a finality that felt right. I placed the note on the door, taped it carefully so it would be the first thing she'd see when she returned. And then I waited. The waiting was the hardest part. The house was too quiet, every creak, every whisper of the wind reminder of the emptiness that now filled it. I sat in the living room, staring at the boxes, my mind replaying the events of the past few days, the moments that had led to this. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold, a story that was familiar yet distant. I tried to focus on the future, to think about what came next. But the uncertainty loomed, a shadow that I couldn't quite shake. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind a tangled web of thoughts and emotions. I wondered how she would react, what she would say when she found the note, saw her things packed by the door. Part of me wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, to understand the pain she'd caused. But another part of me felt a strange sadness, a quiet sorrow that lingered in the silence. This wasn't how I'd imagined our life together would end. But then again, nothing about this had been what I'd imagined. The next morning, I went about my day as if everything were normal. I made coffee, read the paper, tried to ignore the emptiness that lingered in the house. I went for a walk, the crisp morning air a welcome distraction. As I walked, I felt a sense of clarity, a calmness that surprised me. I had done what I needed to do. The decision was made, the line drawn. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. By the time I returned, it was nearly noon. I stood in the kitchen, pouring myself a second cup of coffee, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart raced, a mixture of anticipation and dread. I stood by the window, watching as she stepped out of the car, her face a mixture of confusion and disbelief as she saw the boxes lined up by the door. She walked up to the door slowly, hesitantly, as if trying to process what she was seeing. When she reached the door, she noticed the note. I watched as she read it, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment, she stood there, frozen, the note clutched in her hand, her gaze shifting from the boxes to the door, and then back to the note. I could see the shock, the disbelief, the realization dawning on her face. She looked around, as if expecting me to appear, to confront her, to give her a chance to explain. But I stayed hidden, watching from a distance, my heart pounding as I waited for her reaction. She tried the door, her hand reaching for the handle, twisting it in vain. I could see the frustration, the anger building as she realized she was locked out. She banged on the door, calling my name, her voice muffled through the glass. I stood there, my heart heavy, but my resolve unshaken. This was her choice. She had made her decision, and now she was facing the consequences. After a few minutes, she stopped banging, her shoulders slumping as she realized I wasn't going to open the door. She looked at the boxes, her gaze lingering on them for a moment before she turned back to the car. I watched as she opened the trunk, began loading her things one by one, her movements slow and deliberate, each box a reminder of the life she was leaving behind. When she was done, she stood by the car, looking back at the house one last time. For a moment, our eyes met through the window. I could see the regret, the sorrow in her gaze, a silent apology that hung in the air between us. But I held my ground, my face calm, my heart resolute. This was the end. After Sophie left, the weight of the past few days lingered in the silence of the house. I stood at the window, watching her car disappear down the street, her figure shrinking until she was nothing more than a blur on the horizon. The emptiness settled around me, and though I had prepared myself for this moment, nothing could have readied me for the stillness that followed. It was done. She was gone, and I was finally alone. The relief I had anticipated was nowhere to be found. Instead, a dull ache began to spread, seeping into every corner of the house. The life we'd shared was gone, packed away in boxes now sitting in the back of her car, leaving only the bare walls and empty spaces that once held her presence. I wandered through the rooms, taking in the silence, the memories clinging to each familiar spot, each corner where we had laughed, argued, or simply existed side by side. Now, all that remained was an echo of a life I barely recognized. In the days that followed, I tried to settle into a routine. I returned to work, immersing myself in projects, staying late at the office, filling my days and nights with tasks that required focus and left no room for lingering thoughts. I became a regular at the gym, pushing myself harder each day, as if I could sweat out the pain, drown it in a sea of physical exhaustion. But no matter how many hours I worked or how many miles I ran, the emptiness remained, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface in the quiet moments. Friends reached out, sensing something was off, but I kept my distance, brushing off their questions with vague excuses. I didn't have the energy to explain, to go through the motions of retelling the story. It felt too raw, too personal, like a wound that had only begun to heal. Instead, I kept to myself, existing in a world of routines and obligations, the quiet solitude my only company. One evening, after another long day at the office, I returned home to find a letter waiting for me on the doorstep. My name was scrawled across the envelope in familiar handwriting. For a moment, I stood there, staring at it, the ache in my chest resurfacing as I recognized Sophie's handwriting. I picked it up, my hand trembling slightly as I opened it, unfolding the letter with a sense of dread and curiosity. "Dear Mark," it began, the words hesitant, as if she, too, had struggled to find the right things to say. "I know that you may never forgive me for what I've done, and I don't expect you to. I don't deserve your forgiveness, nor do I have any right to ask for it. But I need you to understand why I did what I did. I need you to know that I didn't mean to hurt you, even though I know that's exactly what I did." Her words poured out, a confession of sorts, each sentence a reminder of the life we had shared and the mistakes that had brought it to an end. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling lost in the routines of our lives, of needing something to fill the void she had carried for so long. She wrote about Eric, about the excitement he had brought into her life, the sense of newness that had felt intoxicating, even though she knew it was wrong. She admitted her guilt, her regret, her sorrow for the pain she had caused. "I never wanted this to be the end of us," she wrote, the words tugging at a part of me I had tried so hard to bury. "I thought that maybe, somehow, we could find our way back to each other. But I see now that I was selfish, that I took something from you that I can never give back. I hurt you in a way that can't be undone, and for that, I am truly sorry." As I read, a mixture of anger and sadness swelled within me, each word a reminder of the betrayal, of the trust she had shattered. Part of me wanted to throw the letter away, to erase her words, to rid myself of the pain they had stirred. But another part of me clung to it, needing to understand, to piece together the fragments of a story I had been too afraid to face. She had left me with questions, with an emptiness that felt unbearable, and this letter, in some twisted way, offered a glimpse into the reasons behind her choices. In the weeks that followed, I reread her letter, the words sinking in, settling into the corners of my mind. I tried to reconcile the person she had been with the person she had become, to make sense of the choices that had led us here. I found myself searching for closure, for a way to move forward, but each time I thought I'd found it, her words echoed back, reminding me of the life we had once shared, of the memories that refused to fade. I went through old photos, albums filled with snapshots of vacations, holidays, quiet moments that had once felt like the foundation of our lives. I studied each picture, searching for signs I might have missed, for hints of the loneliness she had written about. But all I saw was the past, a life that had slipped through my fingers, leaving only the shadows of what could have been. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, her letter in my hand, I felt a shift, a subtle change in the ache that had settled within me. The anger had dulled, replaced by a quiet sadness, a sense of acceptance that had crept in without me realizing it. I understood now that there was nothing left to say, no words that could mend what was broken. Our marriage, our life together, was over, and all that remained was the task of letting go. The next morning, I took the letter, along with the photos and memories I had clung to, and placed them in a box. I sealed it, taping it shut with a finality that felt both painful and necessary. I carried the box to the attic, placing it on a shelf alongside other relics of the past, a symbol of the life I was leaving behind. As I climbed down the ladder, a weight lifted, a sense of closure settling in where the ache had once been. In the days that followed, I found a strange peace in the solitude. The routines that had once felt empty now offered comfort, a sense of stability in a world that had been upended. I took up new hobbies, filling my days with activities that brought me joy, that reminded me of the person I had once been, the person I was rediscovering. Slowly, I began to rebuild, each step a reminder that life goes on, that healing is possible, even in the face of loss. One evening, as I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. The ache was still there, a faint reminder of the past, but it no longer defined me. I had found a way to let go, to move forward, to reclaim the pieces of myself that had been lost. And in that moment, I knew that I was finally free. In the months that followed, I found myself slipping into a new rhythm, a life slowly being rebuilt on my own terms. The pain of Sophie's betrayal had faded, leaving behind scars that, while still tender, felt manageable. I had even begun dating again, testing the waters with tentative steps, unsure but willing to try. I didn't expect much, I was still healing. But life felt different, fuller somehow, as if I were rediscovering parts of myself that had been dormant for too long. One Saturday, as I was cleaning out the garage, a task I'd put off for years, I came across a dusty cardboard box labeled, Mark and Sophie. I paused, feeling a slight twinge, memories trickling back like echoes of a life I'd left behind. Inside the box were old Christmas decorations, a few forgotten keepsakes, and, at the bottom, an old digital camera, the kind we'd used before smartphones made them obsolete. Curious, I picked it up, brushing off the dust and turning it over in my hands. I remembered the camera well. We'd taken it on trips, to family gatherings, snapping countless photos. But there was one particular vacation I had forgotten about, a trip we'd taken to the coast in the early years of our marriage. I powered it on, the battery surprisingly still alive, and began flipping through the photos. Each image brought me back, a time capsule of happier days, when we were just Mark and Sophie, laughing, carefree. And then, as I scrolled, I found something that made my heart stop. There was a folder dated only a few months before the separation. I hadn't touched this camera in years, so I didn't expect anything recent. Hesitantly, I opened it, my hands trembling. What I saw was a series of images, grainy but unmistakable, of Sophie with Eric. They were at what looked like a dimly lit restaurant, then walking arm in arm on a street I didn't recognize, laughing and looking at each other with the ease and intimacy of lovers. My stomach twisted, but it wasn't shock or anger that I felt. This was more than just confirmation of her affair, I already knew about Eric. No, it was something else, a sinking feeling, a nagging suspicion that there was more to this story than I had been willing to see. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I needed to know the truth, even if it meant reopening old wounds. That evening, I tracked down Eric's number. I'd seen it enough times in the phone records to have it etched in my memory. After a few rings, he picked up, his voice casual, almost surprised. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Eric, this is Mark," I said, my tone leaving no room for small talk. There was a pause, followed by a quiet exhale. "What do you want, Mark?" "I need to know the truth," I replied. "About you and Sophie." There was a long silence on the other end. I could feel the weight of his hesitation, the words he was holding back. Finally, he spoke. "Fine. Let's meet. Tomorrow. Noon. There's a cafe downtown, near the park." I spent the night in restless anticipation, my mind churning with questions. The next day, I arrived at the cafe, finding Eric waiting at a table near the back, his gaze shifting nervously as I approached. He was younger than I'd remembered, his features softened by an expression of something that almost resembled guilt. We sat in silence for a moment before he finally spoke. "I never wanted this, you know," he said, his voice low. "Sophie, she was unhappy. I thought it was just a fling. But it was more complicated than that." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice steady, though inside, I was unraveling. Eric looked away, then back at me, his face conflicted. "Sophie, she was going through something deep. She kept saying she felt trapped. And then, she'd mention this plan she had. She wanted to leave you, but she needed a way to do it that wouldn't hurt you. I thought it was just talk, but then she started getting specific." "What do you mean, specific?" I asked, an uneasy feeling settling over me. Eric hesitated, his gaze hardening. "She wanted you to find out, Mark. She left her phone unlocked, left messages where you'd see them. She even set up that retreat weekend just so you'd have the chance to get rid of her. Sophie knew you, Mark. She knew you wouldn't stay once you found out. She wanted to be free, but she didn't have the courage to end it. So she made you do it." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I struggled to breathe, my mind reeling as I processed what he'd just said. All this time, I'd thought I was the one taking control, reclaiming my life. But Sophie had orchestrated it all, every detail designed to lead me to that final decision. I had been a pawn in her game, an unwitting participant in her plan to escape a marriage she no longer wanted. Eric's voice pulled me back. "Look, I'm not proud of what we did. I should have stopped it. But Sophie, she was relentless. She needed you to end it, to make it easier for both of you. And I guess I was part of that plan." I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief, a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't contain. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as I turned to leave. Eric didn't try to stop me, his gaze falling to the table as I walked away. As I stepped outside, the air felt heavy, the world spinning around me as I tried to make sense of everything. Sophie's betrayal was no longer about the affair, it was about the deception, the manipulation, the way she had pulled me into her scheme without a second thought. I had been played, my emotions, my love, my sense of control, all used against me in a way I had never imagined. For days, I wrestled with the revelation, the truth settling over me like a shadow I couldn't shake. But as the initial shock wore off, something shifted. I realized that Sophie's actions, her choices, no longer had power over me. I was free, not because she had orchestrated it, but because I had chosen to walk away. I had taken control, and no matter how calculated her plan had been, it didn't define me. I was stronger than her lies, stronger than the story she had written. With time, the wounds began to heal. I moved forward, not with anger or regret, but with a newfound clarity, a sense of self that was unbreakable. Sophie's betrayal had been a lesson, a painful one, but one that had taught me the value of resilience, of self-worth. I was no longer defined by her choices, her manipulations. I was my own person, free in a way I had never been before. And as I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I knew one thing for certain: the future was mine, unclouded, untethered, waiting for me to make it my own.